Islam has seen great challenges along history. No time has shown greater challenge for the faith than today. It's not a remotely physical nor spiritual threat, but one that is rooted in the contemporary definition of Islamic law in light of the advent of the laws of nations, and the loyalties and consequences that come with being part of a non-faith-based system of governance for Muslims. Deen and Dawla, that's religion and nation. A struggle, if you may, of what seem to be extremes, positioned by many scholars and academians as polar opposites. Opposites that have yet to discover a comprehensive reconciliation to their cooperation and cohabitation. Can they even cohabitate, or are they mutually exclusive of each other? Before we answer these questions, let's discuss why this challenge has become so overwhelming and vital. Over the last 100 years, with the creation of nation-states all across the Middle East and Muslim world, civic, rule-based societies have sprung up and have molded themselves into modern independent countries. Some Muslim nations have gone the theocracy route, whereas others towards a full-fledged secular iteration. What is apparent is that there's no clear consensus amongst Muslim countries on how a nation might be ideally governed in light of being both Islamic and modern. And this lack of agreement that reigns mainly comes from one primary factor, and that's how Muslims and their subgroups don't agree whatsoever on how the interpretation of Islam and its laws should progress with the passing of time and along with the advancement of humanity itself. And that takes us to a very important and well-known saying by the Prophet Muhammad that deals specifically with the element of how the Islamic religion is perceived or understood in line with progress and the passing of time. At the end of every 100 years, Allah will send to this nation those who will renew its religion for it. The most important Arabic word used in this hadith, or saying, is tajdid. Tajdid can suggest renewal, renovation, and even possibly reform. And what exactly is this renewal of? There are two lines of thought associated with this saying. The first is that Islam will see the straying of its believers away from the essence of the faith, and in turn there will be those that will shepherd the Muslims back with their worldly knowledge towards the righteous path. The second is of a renewal of the understanding of what the Quran and the Sunnah, the Prophet's guidance, meant in terms of the divine laws that have been interpreted and integrated into the faith at the time, that would then impact many of the elements of Muslim life, such as social, economic, and political belief and behavior. The hadith can also allude to the creation of laws, which is mainly achieved through ijtihad, meaning interpretations, that were either clarified by the actions or explanations of the Prophet, his companions, and his caliphs at the nascency of Islam, the era of ideal Islam, or by the subsequent Muslim scholars and jurists further along in history that were required to address certain elements of Islamic law, big or small, that weren't clearly covered by the Quran or the hadiths. And these interpretations and their variations are what today cause the numerous divisions in how Islamic groups and subsequently nations govern themselves. One additional explanation for the word tajdid that I failed to mention earlier, and one that really can't be extracted literally from the word tajdid, it is assumed as the only version by a great number of Muslim subgroups, is the word return. And that means a return to the old ways. And with the introduction of this definition, Muslims were presented with a new extreme that negated most interpretations that had come into effect over the centuries. This is how Muslims and their belief systems are mainly broken down into one group that is convinced that Islamic law should be solely based on the ways of ideal Islam, a return from Muslims who had strayed away from the principles of the faith, a correction that would reintroduce the ways of old and dispel any innovations or traditions that had deviated believers from the righteous path. And the opposite group were Muslims who believed that Islam in its particularness had a time and place. They were to look at the context and changing times in deducing how life and the human condition were different to how they were in the past, and use reason and intellect to understand the words of the Quran as well as the guidance of the Prophet in a new light, in structuring their contemporary laws while still maintaining the fundamental principles of the faith. The latter of the two obviously would lead to greater subdivisions within the faith that is apparent in its many denominations and sects. And that takes us to the consequential three methods that Muslim societies have today in creating their governing systems. Equations that present the dominance of either religion or nationalism as the primary method of governance. To define these equations, though, let's start with their range, a timeline of history denoting the beginning of Islam and all the way to the present day and even beyond into the perceivable future. Up until the 18th and 19th centuries, before the rise of nations and the advent of the modern era, the acts of renewing Islamic societal traditions or philosophical discourses always meant the return to the form of old, of the days of the Prophet and the Sahaba, the companions. So let's start with this first equation that reflects this exact old-school method. It was a default return and look back to legal interpretations of the days of ideal Islam, when the rule of religion was adopted over any other type of governance. This approach of looking towards the past as a basis for societal and legal conduct brought with it the notion of Islamic Shari'a as the sole realization of laws for modern states. Nations looked at Islamic law to drive their statehood in terms of justice systems, societal behavior, and economic dealings. Historically, such an equation was reflected in the foundation of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, with a pact between the Al Saud and the Wahhabis. The second method was the selective integration of religion with nationalism, a collage of laws that both separated and merged state and religion along selective lines. Strategically drawn lines that would either gravitate one type of governance closer to religious law in some areas, while pulling others closer to secularism. This method recognized that looking to the present and the future was an important basis point for renewal. Modernity had introduced new conditions that couldn't be addressed by the old form, and in some cases, new interpretations had to be generated in order for the Muslim nations to carry forward in this new day and age. This version was a mix somewhere in between governance of religion and statehood, and nations such as Jordan, Indonesia, and Egypt are all varying iterations of this method. The third and final equation never looked back towards the Muslim past any longer. Implementers of this model adopted the dominance of nationalism in its most secular sense over any version of Islamic law. The ethnic and national history was more important to the state than that of its religious history. And therefore, new systems of governance were imported from Western precedents that were new to the Arab and Muslim world. Concepts that contradicted fundamental Islamic principles but were nonetheless accommodated because the priority was in achieving the best version of statehood over that of the preservation of the Islamic interpretations within the law. Turkey is a defining example of this third method. The hadith mentioned at the outset of the video, and more specifically the phrase, "those who will renew," later on in Islamic history became manifest in actual personalities along the Muslim timeline. Those who showed great enlightenment in the world of religious jurisprudence and impact on the Muslim nation would then be known as the mujaddideen, the renewers or reformers, a person or persons of supreme morality and high religious understanding. There's a significant question about who is identified and who has been claimed as a mujaddid in Muslim history, but the names are quite significant and recognizable. These revitalizers of the faith start with Umar ibn Abdul Aziz in the 1st century Hijri, Muhammad al-Shafi'i and Ahmad ibn Hanbal in the 2nd, al-Bukhari and al-Sha'iri in the 3rd, and so on up until we reach the 20th century. There are over 46 personalities that have been claimed to have been a mujaddid throughout history. And now we go back to my original questions. Can they even cohabitate? Or are they mutually exclusive of each other? Well, the answer to these questions is, of course, they can cohabitate. Actually, more accurately, there's no other way for them to exist. As much as Islam can't shake off the modernity and the laws of nations, secularism can't operate in a vacuum within Muslim nations. So the likelihood of the two extreme options of the governance either solely by religion or by a secular nation state, where one is totally dismissive of the other, is remote. The middle ground option of looking at the past while also acknowledging the present and in parallel looking at the future is the only way for Muslim nations, to allow for the Muslim nations to excel and prosper while carrying along with them their Muslim identity. The challenge with this option is finding the perfectly balanced line between religion and statehood that grants consensus amongst the largest contingent of Muslims. The essence of the hadith I relayed at the beginning of this video is about the need for renewal of faith, not within its core principles, ethics, or morality, but in avoiding the potential straying away from the pillars of the faith while renovating the universality of the faith's message for all people, time eternal, far and wide, and how it manifests itself within a world that is rapidly changing on the political, economic, and social fronts. And with these changes, maybe this hadith provides opportunities to the Islamic people when they're not left behind, playing catch-up to those that have sped off into modernity. At the same time, allowing for Muslim nations to steer clear of forsaking the critical elements of the Islamic faith in the pursuit of modernity. As I said, the solution lies somewhere in the middle, and most likely it's maybe not a one-size-fits-all equation. Maybe each nation might find their ideal balance tipping slightly towards one end of the scale or the other. What is undeniable is that this dialogue between how Muslims renew their interpretation of the Islamic faith and looking backward, forward, or both is going to be ever-present, especially with the accelerated development of their own nations, the advancements of their geopolitics, economies, and societies, and in parallel with the ultra-fast global progress of technology. The hope is that whatever direction takes place does indeed protect Islam and Muslims from the failures of other peoples that have abandoned their spirituality, humility, and place within the collective existence for the sake of being one with the unfamiliar and misplaced New Age ideals.